transportation in a single sentence, because she got to read an early draft and she realized it was confusing. So here it is. Embrace your possibilities by looking first and always to our poets, artists, and storytellers, because it is our shared imagination that pushes back the darkness. In the beginning was the crayon, and the crayon was Harold's. Harold and the Purple Crayon, a book by Crockett Johnson, tells a little story that speaks for itself. But I will just mention that the journey that Harold takes through a world that he creates with the Purple Crayon recapitulates the spiritual evolution of Western culture from Genesis to existentialism. Harold decides to take a walk, but it's dark. So using his purple crayon, he draws a moon to see by. Fiat lux. Harold's personal moon, his reflection of a sun that he cannot see in the night, both illuminates and frames his journey. Next, Harold draws a long, straight path to follow on his walk. But like all long, straight paths, it goes nowhere. So he draws a shortcut, and then a small Eden consisting of one apple tree and a reptile to guard the apples. But the reptile scares him into the sea where he would drown, but with a boat which, like Noah, he creates to rescue himself. Realizing he's lost, he draws and climbs a steep mountain to find a viewpoint, but then falls off the opposite side. He rescues himself again with a balloon full of hot air, which is the usual way we recover when we've not imagined the other side of our viewpoints. He wants to go home, so he draws a city full of buildings with windows, but none are his. He draws a policeman to ask directions. Not surprisingly, the authority he creates points the same way he's already going. But finally, Harold does find his way. He remembers he is home when his window frames his moon. He draws that frame and then draws his covers to sleep. This is a beautiful book, simply illustrated, all in purple. It tells or retells the story of creation. A boy creates his world and follows its possibilities to whatever comes next. Harold creates a complete life. A source of light, the obvious path that goes nowhere, the shortcut to the apple tree that results in fear and trembling, 9 pies to share with friends, a vision quest, self-rescues, uncertainty of his own authority, a homecoming, and finally sleep. Unlike the God of Genesis, Harold does not create all light, only his moon. But his moon is enough to push back the darkness, illuminating the world that he creates. Harold's possibilities are confined to the cone of light traveling with him, bounded by night on all sides. But by acts of imagination, Harold can escape that darkness and have a big life. Harold and the Purple Crayon came out in 1955. In a suspicious coincidence, in 1956, just 1 year later, the poet and Zen scholar Gary Snyder started writing his epic poem, Mountains and Rivers Without End. It took him 40 years to finish, even though he obviously borrowed the plot from Harold and the Purple Crayon. In Snyder's poem, a guy walks around, sometimes in cities, but mostly in the backcountry. He's making art as he goes. Sound familiar? Snyder borrowed his title, too, naming his poem for a famous 17th century landscape painting by Lu Yuan, which, in yet another suspicious coincidence, Harold's Mountain resembles very closely. Here's how Snyder's poem ends. Walking on walking, underfoot, earth turns. Streams and mountains never stay the same. The space goes on, but the wet black brush tip, drawn to a point, lifts away. The space that goes on for Snyder must be the world of possibilities that started as blank paper. The blank paper on which Snyder and Lu Yuan both composed their versions of Mountains and Rivers Without End. And in that space, in that cone of light, the wet black brush is drawn to a point because artists and humans are always drawn to some point, some meaning, like a moth is drawn to a moon. Snyder is capturing our monkey brain passion to create some meaning before we die, before our wet black brush lifts away. Naturally, Snyder borrows this too from Crockett Johnson. Crockett Johnson ends his story with, "The purple crayon dropped to the floor, and Harold dropped off to sleep." Now this is a children's book, so Harold is just going down for the night, but you get the point. Snyder got it. Like Snyder and Crockett Johnson, our poets constantly remind us that our possibilities are limited by our mortality. But they do this even as they celebrate the persistence of the shared possibilities that we've created through our imagination. Take Keats. He tells us that some old urn, with its painted scenes of mad pursuits, wild ecstasy, ever-piping songs, and happy, happy love, shall remain. Long after old age shall this generation waste. Ouch. Centuries earlier, Basho got this down in 3 lines, writing, "They don't live long, but you'd never know it. The cicadas cry." So yes, life is short, but the possibilities we create through our imagination persist just as our language, our singing, our cries, our stories, our poems, and our work in this world persist. Building our possibilities on the persistent foundation of the human imagination eases our dread about the finite portion of our lives, that part of ourselves that our work will leave behind. But I'm trying to get at another point here too, which is that we create and share our best possibilities together. We co-create our world from the work and the legacies of those who best articulate our possibilities. Artists borrow stuff from each other all the time. They get away with it because they transform it into something original. Clive James tells us originality is not just a quality of poetry. Originality is poetry. And they get away with borrowing because we understand that a lot of art is about art. I'm sure you noticed both Crockett Johnson and Gary Snyder were not just making art, but writing about making art. And Snyder takes us further by writing about making art. He starts his great poem with a prefatory quotation from Painting of a Rice Cake by Dogen Zenji, who was the guy who introduced Zen to Japan. Dogen is talking about the koan that goes, "A painted rice cake does not satisfy hunger." Dogen writes, "If you say the painting is not real, then the material phenomenal world is not real. The Dharma is not real. Unsurpassed enlightenment is a painting. The entire phenomenal universe and the empty sky are nothing but a painting. Since this is so, there is no remedy for satisfying hunger other than a painted rice cake. Without painted hunger, you never become a true person." Dogen tells us our truest hunger is for a world we create. Sound familiar? How about Harold satisfying his hunger on those 9 pies he drew? I think Dogen would call Harold a true person. He was certainly true to his moose and his porcupine with whom he shared his leftovers. Harold was true to the possibilities he created. Because a writer's world literally is just what he imagines, his work reminds us that our truest possibilities are what we imagine. Writers love the recursiveness of making art about art, which celebrates and justifies our shared imaginations. Unlike programmers, writers like recursion best when it is unbounded, out of any one person's control, and where the reflected lights of many moons push back the shadows at the edge of the current frame. Writers and the rest of us are both condemned and privileged to borrow the meaning that others have already found in the world. All of us appropriate art simply by appreciating it, where we become responsible as the audience, the critics, and the teachers. We blow away the chaff for our children. When we explain the work, it explains us. We are all at best, and at our best, co-creators of the possibilities of our world, acknowledging our shared truth and beauty, pointing it out to others, and adding our own layers as we hand it down. So I'm not ashamed to look for my best possibilities by starting with the imagination of others. It's hard to cabin Gary Snyder's imagination and the possibilities he has embraced in the space that he has shown his light on. He is, or has been, a farmer, a mountain climber, a lookout, an engine room oiler, a poet, an essayist, a Zen Buddhist, an anarchist, a student of Native American culture, a translator of Chinese and Japanese poetry, an English professor, and an environmentalist. So as I go about my work as an environmental lawyer, I aspire to affect, in some small way, the principles of deep ecology, a possibility for life on Earth that Snyder embraces and helped so much to articulate. In a sentence, deep ecology promotes the inherent worth of all living beings, regardless of their instrumental utility to humans. Notice how neatly our first and seventh principles bookend Snyder. But I thank Snyder more than the UU website for that, because he embedded it in poetry and a life of possibilities that moves me. Imagination naturally leads to community. Talking about Snyder, poet Jim Dodge tells us that imagination is about seeking a larger consciousness and a connection with the other, what Dodge calls a deep, true regard for someone or something beyond the self, a sense of shared immanence, basically the predication for love. Surely if UUs believe in something like God, it is that predication for love. The job of imagination is to reveal that shared immanence and to connect us to it and to each other. Snyder and his secret source, Crockett Johnson, do that for me. So I confess that for my best possibilities, I borrow everything I can understand, and probably a lot that I can't, from the imaginations of those who've gone before me. As they say in urban slang, color me purple. It's a fair cop.